Still on the Russia-Ukraine war, the International Monetary Fund says the ongoing crisis in Ukraine threatens to undo Africa's post-COVID-19 economic recovery. Now, IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said this after a meeting with African Ministers of Finance, African Central Bank governors and representatives from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa to discuss the impact of the crisis in Ukraine. Now, Mrs. Georgieva said African countries were poised to feel the pain of rising food and fuel prices. Ms. Georgieva said she was encouraged by the strong interest from African policymakers in continuing dialogue on policy responses. She added that the IMF is willing to help African countries mitigate the effects of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Let's talk this through by speaking with Executive Director, Lead Network, Chukwuma Okenwa, who is joining me to discuss the implication of Russia war on oil and food prices in Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining us from Enugu. What has been your reading of the impact? Right. What has been your reading of the impact of the Ukraine-Russia war since it actually started? The impact of food and prices of commodities on the African soil?
Of course, this is visibly two nations that were viable economically suffering. Whilst Ukraine is suffering a clampdown from Russia, other world powers are busy sanctioning Russia. So we see two things happening. And the interesting thing to note is that many countries, even down to Africa, in the Middle East, and some part of Western and Central Europe, depends on these two nations for fuel and food. And of course, you know, one of the challenges we've had in Africa is energy crisis. Even the very nations that have the oil, sometimes having the refining capacity, like the instance of Nigeria, it's a challenge. But you just read out, of course, what happened, and a good number of Nigerians who are continually being repatriated back to the country because of the crisis that is currently ongoing in Ukraine. What that means to us is these are Nigerians losing their source of livelihood. Certainly also that will impact on our diaspora remittances. We know that one of the ways we gain forex is through diaspora remittances. And then back to the issue of oil and crude prices. Yes, of course, it's no gainsaying that Russia is one of the major oil contributors, and that certainly has significantly affected or influenced a decline in oil supply, resulting to a situation where you have like some contraction in the market, leading to an induced inflation, the one that was not foreseen. And the interesting thing about the economy goes a long way to show us how we are so interconnected, just like the human body, that when one part is actually suffering, the rest of the world is suffering. So I am thinking that in the way the world has so connected, and at this particular point, sanctioning, economic sanctioning, wouldn't actually be in the best interest of the world, because sanctioning Russia is certainly also sanctioning every other nation that depends on Russia for one thing or the other. I'm thinking the world actually could come up with a template to tackle issues like this better than just mere economic sanctions, which also affect the rest of the world.
So you're not satisfied with the kind of sanctions that are being meted out on Russia, especially, you know, the international community coming together to ensure that Putin actually withdraws from this war. But then it seems to be very adamant and, you know, willing to fight on and soldier on. But all the same, is it possible for Africa, the African continent, some of the countries in Africa, for instance, the crude oil price which has gone up, is it possible that Nigeria, for instance, make gains out of this war?
Well, the truth of the matter is it would have just been like the best time for nations like Nigeria, that is one of the top 6 oil producers. But unfortunately, we do not have the refining capacity as it were. So we still have a situation where we sell the crude prices at raw prices, and then still have to pay humongous prices to import the one that we have to use. But then on a large scale, what that has done for us in terms of budget is that the initial projected benchmark for oil prices have been raised by this crisis, you know, by the war that is going on in Ukraine. And it's something probably we could take advantage of. But to be able to fully utilize all of these chances that pops up itself in the international community, Nigeria must enhance its capacity to refine its own oil.
Well, that's really, we really don't know when that is actually going to happen, talking about the refineries that we have in the country. But if you try to look back in time, in 2020, Africa countries imported agricultural products from worth $4 billion from Russia. Ukraine also exported agricultural products worth $2.9 billion to Africa in 2020. Talk to us about how these is also going to affect the food supply chain and what exactly that African continents need to do, because currently we are talking about drought in some eastern parts of the African continent. So talk to us about how Africa can actually mitigate the impact of these on them.
Certainly, this is certainly will make it like the cost of food will go high, certainly, given the level of importation we engage in terms of food. But the interesting thing Africa can learn is Africa has a young population, we have the fertile land. What actually stopped Africa from leveraging on the demographic dividend of having a youthful Africa to enhance labor? We have like the land. Africa as a continent can comfortably contain all the people in America, all the people in China, all the people in Europe, all put together. So Africa is such a large continent. So one would wonder why we will sit down with all of the youthful population and let these other nations like keep supplying food to Africa. I think that one of the major causes that our policymakers must begin to focus on now is not just to tout on interventions on agriculture, agrarian revolution here and there, but to practically deploy that as a core policy, a policy trust. For instance, like the NYSC, just having the aspect of a large number of core members going into classroom to teach, I think it's not just sustainable in this time. What about having a good number of them engaging in agriculture? I believe with that we can address the issue of insufficiency of food.
Yeah.
Africa should be exporting food to non-Africans and not the other way around.
Anyway, we look forward to seeing what the IMF is saying, that they are going to help to mitigate some of these impact on the on African countries. Executive Director, Lead Network, Chukwuma Okenwa, thank you so much for our insight.
Thank you.